You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. From Mamma Mia, this is No Filter. I'm Mia Freedman, and I wanted to pop a little extra bonus episode into the feed this week because a lot of people have been talking about the new series called Fake that stars Keddie about a woman who falls in love with a con man. And today we wanted to bring you the true story of the woman in that series in an interview that I did with Stephanie Wood, who is played by Asha in Fake. I did this interview a couple of years ago with Stephanie. She's in her late 40s, or she was, when she decided to go on a date with a guy she met online. And she'd been online dating for a while and had found it pretty unsatisfying, as many people do. So when she met this guy called Joe, who was handsome and charming and seemingly different from the others, she fell for him. She fell pretty hard and pretty fast, and she had no idea that it would change the course of her life forever. Now Stephanie is an award-winning journalist and an author. She is smart, she is experienced, and she does not stand for bullshit. But when she met Joe, all of that sort of fell away because, as we know, love does funny things to the brain. And Joe turned out to be, well, as the name suggests, a total fake. And Fake also became the name of Stephanie's book, which is now the name of this new series on Paramount+. It stars Keddie as Stephanie and David Wenham as Joe. It's being hailed as a love and lies-fueled thriller, and this is the true story behind it from the woman who lived it. Here's Stephanie Wood. Steph, when you met Joe, what was your first contact like with him?
We met through online dating, and we caught up for a drink at a bar in Sydney. There were no sparks for me, and I don't think for either of us really, although who knows what he ever felt. I thought he was a little awkward. I thought he was a bit short, which he proved not to be. He must have been hunching down in that chair. He talked a lot about himself, and women are pretty used to men talking a lot about themselves. And I sort of peppered the conversation with questions, which as a journalist you learn to do to keep conversations going. I think we were there for a couple of drinks and said goodbye. And I didn't imagine I'd see him again.
How long had you been online dating for? And what's it like as a woman who's not 22?
Yeah, I hadn't been doing it for a long time. I've not done a lot of it because I find it so awful.
Why is it awful?
Oh, I guess the calibre of men you're meeting, I'm sorry to say. I find it hugely awkward, sort of walking into a space, a bar, a restaurant, to meet someone that you've never, ever set eyes on before and you have no context for who they are. It's awkward. They're usually incredibly disappointing. I think a friend pushed me into it right back in probably around 2005 when I'd broken up with a guy I thought I was going to marry. I think maybe it was just starting around then.
So you were in your 30s then?
Late 30s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, late 30s.
If you're a woman in your late 30s, what kind of men are on the apps?
Well, of course, it's widely variable. I was looking for intelligent guys, which, is that okay?
Yeah.
I suppose I wanted someone who seemed to have a bit of wit about them and a bit of humour. I've never sort of had a physical checklist at all. If I were to be honest, I don't want someone who's short. But apart from that, I'm fairly open to, physical imperfection.
How did you decide who to swipe left on and who to swipe right on?
Well, in those days it was a bit different. The Tinder didn't exist, and I've only ever used Tinder once in my life. It was just looking at what their interests were mainly, and their political leanings was important to me, I suppose, and how well they wrote.
Tell me about that, because I imagine as you look at more and more profiles, you learn some red flags and some green flags.
I wouldn't know about red and green flags. It's more about what you like and what you don't like.
I kind of more mean that. Like, what would make you go, oh, yeah, I might
someone
think about him.
Who speaks writes intelligently and well without spelling mistakes.
High bar for a journalist.
Well, it is a high bar, but is that such a high bar for someone? I don't know. Isn't that for a moderately intelligent person, isn't that half-decent writing skills. Like, I don't know, maybe I am too fussy about that.
Don't doubt yourself.
But
you like what you like. And
you like what you like. So that was always important. And I guess I was looking for compassion, someone who was thoughtful and compassionate and sincere.
Women in their late 30s are notorious for scaring men because of the whole biological clock situation. Did you find that was kind of a subtext in all the...
No, and this is incredibly weird, I imagine, for women who are in their late 30s now to hear who are still looking. And I wrote an article for Good Weekend about this probably in 2016, I think it was, about not having had children. There was so little said back then about women's fertility. It really was. And I've gone back through the archives of newspaper archives to see how much was written about women's fertility and declining fertility, and very little was written. I think I was probably a little, and I wanted to have kids, but I was a little I don't think I ever had a surging biological clock, which I know a lot of women do. I was concerned. I did want to have them, but I thought I could still have them in my 40s. And as I said, there was just not a lot written about it.
So you weren't necessarily looking for the father of your children?
No, I don't
Which
think
could put a lot of pressure on things.
Although the guy that I broke up with, who I had thought I might be with, he had some medical issues that could have affected his fertility, and we certainly did talk to doctors about what our chances might be. So it was obviously on my mind, but not in a panicked way. And I certainly would never have raised it. I don't think that was ever my thought. I don't think I ever went to any of these dates, and there would have only been back then about 4 or 5, 6 dates. And I don't think it was on my mind. I think on my mind was, is this guy nice? Is this guy decent? Is he someone I could spend time with? There was one really nice guy, but I don't think he was very much into me, which is okay. Devastating blow at the time, but, you move on from these things. Like, there was one that I think probably ended that period of online dating for me. We met for coffee one afternoon. He wanted to tell me, he wasn't a particularly good-looking man, and that was fine, but he wanted to tell me about his recent holiday to India where he'd visited a tantric sex ashram, but had to have STD tests on the way in. Oh. And I just sat there with my coffee in front of me going, in my head, are you serious? You really, really want to tell me about this on our first date?
Well, at least you'd had the STD test.
That's for sure. We never got to check that out, really. But the funniest thing about it was that he recommended it. I don't dabble in the share market, but at the end of that encounter, he said, "Oh, I've got this great share tip for you." When I got home, I actually happened, for a very rare moment, I had some money in my bank account, and I thought, bugger it, I'm just going to go and buy some of those shares. And they actually earned me a bit of money, which I've sold them since. But
That's a silver lining on that very bad date.
That was exactly. And I sort of was so amused by it as well.
What was it about Joe's dating profile that appealed to you?
Again, his writing. He could write and he could express himself. It was articulate. He seemed to have a love for the environment and nature, the things that are important to me. Politics, the current affairs, the world, and a curiosity and an interest in the world. And that came through really strongly on his dating profile.
In that first date, did he tell you he had kids, that he was divorced?
So the foundational story was that he'd been through a fairly ugly divorce. At some point, possibly second, third date, he started to let on that his ex-wife was completely psycho. And why wouldn't I believe that? There are people out there who have mental health problems. He was, now in hindsight, I can see, quite cruel about how he talked about her. But at the time, I took it on face value. He had custody 1 week on, 1 week off with his ex-wife of 2 children, and told me he lived in a harbourside house a modest harbourside house in a well-known suburb of Sydney that he'd built himself. And he told me he was an architect, or retired from architecture and had gone into private equity, and that he had a small sheep farm south of Sydney.
Was he your age?
He was about 3-4 years older than me. So.
And you were in your early 40s by now?
I was in my late 40s by this stage, yeah.
Did he ask much about you on that first date?
Not really. Eventually, and I was getting a bit frustrated by that, because to me that's a bit of a sign that someone's not particularly interested or has very inefficient communication skills. I've been I'm not writing about food right now, but in my background I was a food writer and a restaurant critic. And he eventually asked me a little bit about that, and he made a comment that was probably the biggest red flag of that first date. He said, "You must be very well connected." Well, I'm not especially, and it's not something I seek out. I'd run for a mile from the opening of an envelope sort of thing. It's just not who I am, my world. I find it tedious. I said, "Oh, no, not at all, not at all." He then did this incredible backtrack and sort of reversal of position, which I can now see he often would do when he'd said something that didn't meet with my approval, I suppose. He said, "Oh, no, I wouldn't like it if you were well connected because I'm very private. Even when I was an architect, I didn't like our work, the firm's work being published." And in hindsight, I've got lots of architect friends, and that's the holy grail, to get their work published in architectural magazines, and it's how you get business as well. So it was such a dumb thing for him to say. But I don't know that you're analysing as much at that point. Your mind is so busy sizing them up, I suppose, physically, and trying to think of things to say and trying to keep the conversation flowing without it becoming awkward, that I sensed something wasn't quite right, but I moved on. You kind of have to keep it going in a way.
How did that first unremarkable date turn into a second?
Well, I'd been single for quite a few years, and when you've been single for quite a few years, you start to hear things like, "Oh, you're too fussy, women shouldn't be so picky," and I'd been bored. Like, I have a full, interesting life, but that's a fairly substantial part of life, and when it's not there, it's like, "Oh, here we go again, not another night." It would be nice to be with someone. And so I wasn't expecting to hear from him, but he did email me and asked to help me out again, and I thought, "Oh, whatever, I'll go." And I think maybe what happens is that when someone starts to show interest in you, and it's quite clear that it's interest, your head does do a bit of a 360-degree turn. And it was like, "Oh, my God, he's interested in me. Okay, let's have another look at this." And I remember going to that second date and being quite beside myself with nerves, which I hadn't been on the first one. Like, I was just a bit nervy on the first one, but the second one I was like, "Oh, my God, he's interested in me." And it was like the moment he registered interest in me, all of a sudden the game changed a bit, which is silly. It's so silly because
it's something we do.
It's something we do. We should be sizing up constantly for a long time whether they're appropriate, suitable, honest, decent. But instead, I don't think it's uncommon. The moment someone's interested, it often changes the way you view the whole thing.
That's such an important insight, isn't it? And I think as women we're conditioned, "Oh, if he likes me,
yes,
I better be not grateful, but
no. I think gratitude. It's not
I agree.
That might well be the emotion. And I was never like the hottest girl at school or the one that had boys following me, so it had always been a bit exciting when a guy did express interest in me. And it wasn't as if it was uncommon, but it wasn't every minute of every day, as I, in my 20s and 30s when I was in the height of mine.
And it had been a while since.
And it had been a while.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
After a lot of disappointing dates and disappointing...
a lot of time on my own, a lot of guys that had... Well, not a lot of guys, but there were certainly a couple of guys who turned out to be really dishonest. And thankfully it never went beyond a few dates. But then
dishonest in what kind of way?
Guys who turned out to be married. I got the sense that he was estranged from his wife. Turns out they were still living together and according to him had an open relationship.
I wonder if she knew that it was
I wonder
open.
if she knew it was an open relationship. And then another one who turned out to be living with a girlfriend. Yeah. And didn't tell me. Thankfully, they didn't go very far, and I was pretty upset when I discovered, but I wasn't so embedded in the relationship that it was devastating. It was that devastating. I mean, I think they leave their little marks on you.
So Joe was clearly single, and that was important.
Well, yes, on the face of it, he was single, yes.
As we thought at the time. Now, did things accelerate quite quickly?
No, we still did it around a bit. The third date nearly didn't happen because he made another strange comment that in hindsight I should have taken as another red flag. We were discussing which restaurant we should go to, and I said, "Do you want me to book?" And he said, "Yeah, that'd be good. It'd be interesting to see how the waiters react to you if they recognise you." And again, I was
you're
like,
a food critic.
Because I was a food critic. But I'd mostly been a food critic when I lived in Melbourne. I hadn't done so much in Sydney, so I wasn't that well known here, and that suited me fine. if you've ever been recognised by a waiter or a chef in a restaurant who thinks they're going to get a good review or they can get some benefit out of it, it's awful.
It's awkward, yeah.
It's horrible, and I don't like that. And I got really cross with him, and I just slammed. We were emailing at that stage. We hadn't got to the point of having comfortable phone calls. Of course, email opens up all sorts of ways of both dissembling and manipulating the conversation. And if we'd been talking on the phone, I might have perhaps picked up things better, but I just flung an angry response at him and said, you've misunderstood me. That's not who I am at all. And then he somehow in another email a few days later said, so I suppose we're not going out Saturday night then? And I said, no, I'm going away actually now. And he said, I really stuffed up. That wasn't what I meant at all. And now, damn it, I can't find the email he sent me because I've kept most of them. But it was like, damn, I wanted to remember what he'd said. But he convinced me yet again that I'd misunderstood what his intentions were about that night, or his interest in the waiter's recognition. And so we eventually had a third date. And I think, again, it was the fact he was interested in me was making my bells ring.
How soon did you go away for the weekend
That was
together?
after our fourth date. So we had a fourth date where we kissed, and then he said in a text message that night, I'd like to go away with you for the weekend.
To seal the deal?
Yeah, to seal the deal as it was.
I don't want to pry about that, but I do want to ask, was the sex great?
Oh, God, no one's asked me that yet. And it's like, I don't want to talk about this. It was great because I hadn't had it for so long. I don't think guys get this, that women just don't go and single women aren't out there every night having casual sex. Certainly not the ones I know. He was warm and loving. In hindsight, very selfish. I won't say more than that. But at the time, I was loving it.
And I ask that not just because I'm voyeuristic and strange, but because when the sex is good in a relationship or there hasn't been sex for a while, that can be confusing as well for a woman.
Yeah,
I've experienced where that can change my brain chemistry and think, oh, I really like you. And it's like, no, that was just good sex. It's not, doesn't mean you're a good person or it doesn't mean that
it was good
love.
Enough that I think it was completely turning my head and altering my chemistry. And in fact, as I write in Fake, our brain chemistry when we're in love completely changes.
You use a Norwegian, is it a Norwegian?
Foddelskett, and I don't pronounce that properly, I know, but it's the heady period of love where you're completely tied in knots with love and beside yourself and can't think straight.
Quite bonkers.
Quite nuts. And there are scientific, it's just almost a pop culture word as I understand it in Norway. There are scientific reasons for it. The ancient part of our brain, the limbic system, is surging with neurotransmitters and hormones because this is fundamental to our biology, isn't it? To mate and to reproduce. It's so fundamental. And also it's fundamental to want to attach to somebody because that's how we survive in the wild, in primitive
it's
terms.
primal.
It's very primal.
How much time did you spend together in those early months?
I would see him probably 2 or 3 days every fortnight, which of course is not much. But I was under the impression he had the children on the other week. I felt as if I was in a very delicate situation, that he talked about the children being very fragile and him being very fragile as a result of the divorce. And I thought, I can't go in like a bull at a gate here. I can't demand to meet the children. That's not right. I've got to be sympathetic to this situation. And if I do get demanding and say I must meet your children or I must see your house, I could just ruin everything.
Had you dated a guy with kids before?
No, never. Never. I mean, my instinct was go gently. Go very, very gently.
So you didn't meet his kids at first. Did you meet each other's friends?
He met a few of my friends, but not for a while. A couple of times he stood me up when there were events. I was going to a Christmas party at a journalist friend's home and he was meant to join me. Funny thing, he didn't come. There was an excuse. And this pattern started very early, the cancellations.
How early?
Probably within, 3 months. I mean, there was a period there where I actually went to the States for 5 weeks for work, and so it was all a bit truncated and remote distance relationship for a little while I was away. But we sort of started to go out seriously probably end of August 2014, but by November he was starting to cancel on me.
What sort of reasons would he give for cancelling?
The most insane reasons. He'd been poisoned by sheep drench. He was in his loo, his dunny on a hill on the farm where he just had a shack, which is apparently why I never got to see it. Vomiting. He was terribly ill. He had a tooth infection. These are all not in chronological order. These are the sort of excuses that unfolded over the sort of 15-month period we were together. A truck carrying his sheep had tipped over and there was chaos and carnage. His dog had been bitten by a snake. His son had been running around a friend's pool and fallen over and been concussed. His daughter had asthma. His daughter had fallen out of a tree and damaged her collarbone.
He had a lot of bad luck.
He had a lot of bad luck. I mean, I started to get I suffer anxiety, as so many people do. This made me so anxious. It was hard to separate whether there was instinct about something not being right or it was just my anxiety. You know, people say, oh, you should follow your instinct. But when you're anxious, like,
so true.
What's instinct? What's anxiety? I couldn't tell. I was so keen to try and make it work. At some point in the relationship, maybe 6 months in, he'd said he'd sold the little farm with the shack and he was now looking to invest in a much, much larger property, and he started to talk about this specific property. I think what happens in relationships is it's not just the person that you're in love with, it's the idea of the future that you're going to have together that you fall in love with. A love affair is about not just the person that you're in love with, but about the future that you've fallen in love with, or the idea of this future you might have together. And so he was looking at investing in this big property. It was such a spread, such a pile, that it was on Sotheby's real estate website.
So it existed, this
it totally,
Happy Valley
absolutely
place that you talked about buying.
existed. I mean, the detail that he talked about, the sale, the negotiations, the neighbours, the people he was vying with to get it. He talked about constantly going down there and having meetings with the owner to discuss what would be included in the sale and what wouldn't. There were council problems and there were water rights. I mean, the detail was immense, and eventually he took me to see it. And it was not the sort of place that you arrive at on a Saturday morning and wander around and then leave, you know, without an invitation. It was an appointment-only style, large, multi-bedroom, multi-living area, huge estate. And we went there and met the owners and we walked around, and the wife took me on this tour and said, I do hope he gets it. I do hope Joe gets it. I don't know what's going on, but I hope he gets it.
So was he wealthy?
Well, that's what he'd led me to believe. We never did anything lavish, but I'm not a designer handbag kind of person. And so he drove a beat-up old Land Rover Defender. He didn't wear particularly special clothes. And I just took that to be someone who had money but was understated and didn't care about the trappings of wealth, which I really liked that approach. He'd pay for meals, and with my restaurant habit, we went out for dinner quite often, and sometimes I'd pay, but I think probably he paid more than I did. He'd tip taxi drivers. We'd go out for breakfast. He took me away 3 times to country cottages. Again, nothing lavish, but he paid. I'd say he spent at least $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 through the course of the relationship on me.
Did he ever ask you for money?
Never. And he gave me presents. He gave me pearls. He gave me opals. I make jewellery, and he gave me these opals. He gave me these little Victorian antique silver, beautifully engraved trinkets. There were never signs of great wealth, but he told me, he was very sheepishly one day, as though he were almost embarrassed by it. He said, I've got a lot of money. I've got a disgusting amount of money, he said. And he sounded as though he was really embarrassed about it, and as though he were letting me into that secret slowly because he'd come to start to trust me. The idea of an understated multimillionaire is kind of nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I thought that was a really nice quality, that the money didn't really matter that much. There were other things that were more important.
Like you.
Well,
and the future together. And he said things like, I imagine you with grey hair.
In the kitchen of Happy Valley, and which study would you like, the one down the corridor from mine or the one next to mine? Very sexy, enticing kind of hints at what the future might be.
That's very seductive, for women. It's like that, talking about the future, even perhaps before you're thinking of it or allowing yourself to think of it. Yeah, I wouldn't have allowed.
He was the one to introduce the future, not me, because I was too cautious to do so. I probably was the first to say I love you, and he said, no, too soon, and then I pulled right back. But he was starting to paint these pictures that I embedded in my own brain and started to fantasize over. We all do that, don't we? You know, we start to imagine that beautiful, glorious thing lying ahead. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that the money didn't matter. I'm a journalist in an industry that is absolutely going down the toilet. I took a redundancy from Fairfax Media 2 years ago, and quite frankly, I will probably never have another staff position. I never get the benefits of superannuation or any of the things that a staff position brings, and I don't honestly know how, as a journalist, you make your living these days, particularly doing the sort of writing I like to do, which takes a lot of time and is dense and research heavy. So, yeah, it was this relationship promises me him, and I'm in love with him. It promises me a farming future, which I'd always found appealing, this idea of, growing vegetables and having animals. And I'll be able to write and not worry about how I pay my way through life. So the money was important in that way for me.
More of my conversation with Stephanie after this short break. Tell me about him meeting your family.
He stood me up for the first time. He was meant to come for a family barbecue at my place and just didn't show up. And it was my mother and my brother and his family, so it was fairly small.
What do you mean he didn't show up?
I know, and I should have
been.
Well,
for you?
I'm so close to my family that I didn't feel embarrassed. I mean, we're close. I didn't feel embarrassed, but I went into a complete state of anxiety and just balled up on the couch.
What reason did he give?
He didn't. I couldn't get him. I couldn't find him. It was just before Christmas 2014, and I should have left him then. I should have said, no one treats me like that. But I didn't have enough self-esteem. I didn't have the resources to do that. I felt so immersed and entrenched in the relationship by that stage and in love. And the next day I rang him or texted him, and he said, his daughter had asthma. And, that was a really bad thing to do. I'm sorry. And I sort of, over Christmas, I went to Queensland to my mum's. I started to prepare myself for the relationship being over. I actually did a really good job of it. I stopped thinking about him. I stopped, clutching my phone looking for messages. But he kept texting me.
He drew you back in.
He drew me back in. And so when I got back, and then he arrives at my place with a string of pearls, and
all's forgiven.
Yeah, all's forgiven, stupidly, in hindsight. But
what about meeting his kids?
That happened maybe 6-7 months after I'd first met him, and it felt like a huge milestone in the relationship. I mean, I think, if he's willing to introduce... He talked about breaking the bubble. I want to break the bubble between my life and your life. I want you to meet my kids. And I just felt like soaring. I was jubilant. And I met them one night at a Thai restaurant. It was excruciating. They were very quiet and shy. God knows how many other women he'd introduced them to and they had to go through this ordeal with. I was nervous trying to make conversation with just becoming a teenage girl and her younger brother, and it was very difficult. At one stage, I was blundering around with the conversation, and I think I said to the girl, is it hard to remember to pack all the things that you need when you move between mum and dad's place? Terrible question, awful question. What was I thinking? But
I think that's a totally reasonable question.
No, I felt like it was blundering around. But
not at all.
He very quickly wrapped up the night after that. My suspicion now is that he felt that we were getting into dangerous territory where, as I discovered much later, the kids had spent very little time with him. Here's the spoiler alert. He didn't live in the house on the harbour. His ex-wife did still.
Well, I was going to ask you, did you ever go to his house?
No, I didn't ever go to his house. And that was eventually what made me leave the relationship, because he cancelled 2 nights in a row on me when I was meant to be going to the house, and I thought, I can't do this anymore. I was in such a mess by that stage. The excuses for not going to the house they kept evolving. So initially it was, for the first, say, 5 months, I didn't even ask because I thought too soon. So you
spent time at your house?
Well, yeah, we spent time in my apartment. I think my biggest fears were he may not be that into me. Maybe there's another woman. The scale of what I discovered about him afterwards, I could never have imagined. I didn't know that these people really existed.
You're an investigative journalist. The first thing I would have thought you would have done is Google him.
Well, I did. I did Google him, and I found that certain planks of his story were very true. He was the grandson of a very well-known Sydney businessman who'd started a major Australian company, and there's no question about that as a fact. He had lived in this. I saw his driver's licence with the address of this house, this harbourside address. I saw it. When I researched the book, I came to discover some really interesting cognitive science, some work that, well-known cognitive science principles, and one of them is a thing called anchoring, whereby you place importance in some facts at the expense of other facts. So I anchored my beliefs about him and my belief in him, the fact his story was true, in the fact that, well, his grandfather is ex, I've seen his driver's licence, so he must live there, and let other things slip on by.
You wrote lists, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, I wrote lists to try and calm myself down. Like,
what would you write down?
I was trying to still my anxiety, and I thought maybe if I could rationally put things down in writing, I'd calm myself down. I'd write all the reasons why he's not lying to me, reasons why I shouldn't be worried, reasons why the fact he didn't turn up on the weekend shouldn't bother me. And when I look back at those lists, they're all things he said to me. I'm envisaging you with grey hair. I love you completely. Et cetera, et cetera. They were all things he said. They were not actions. They
You'd
were
seen
word.
a dog that he said was then
Oh,
sick,
yeah, the
so
dog
you
was.
knew the dog existed.
I knew the dog existed.
And there was such detail in his excuses.
Exactly.
And they were quite elaborate, weren't they? It was never just like, I can't come.
No.
It's sort of, you talk about it, them unfolding in 3 acts.
Yeah, in the most incredibly detailed way.
How would they transpire?
So, well, for example, this weekend that he said his dog had been bitten by a snake. He was meant to come to my apartment on a Friday night and have dinner with me. He was down at the farm and he was meant to be coming up. And around about 4 PM, I got the text saying I can't find my dog. Then another, and I replied to each of them with concern or questions. And then another one, an hour or two later, found her. We're at the vet. Not sure she's going to make it. She's been bitten by a snake, the vet thinks. Then silence for the rest of the night, nothing, till the next morning. Then a text very early the next morning saying, I think I'll be able to come uptown. We think she'll make it now. Won't be any point in me staying here with her. I'll come up, I'll be there for lunch. Then a few hours later, I've actually got a friend who's a vet in another town and he's coming to look at her. And there were slight contradictions, but I wasn't seeing the contradictions because in the morning he's saying, we think she's going to make it. Well, then if she's going to make it, why do you need to bring another vet? I can see all of these contradictions now. The text went on all weekend with updates, and I'm not going to come.
Really confusing, like being bombarded with details and bombarded.
I
with
think that
information.
what the effect the details had was simply to reassure me of the truth of the story. Why would you? It just seems so real. The vet friend arrived. They went back to his town with the dog. They'd not seen each other for a long time. Their friendship had been a casualty of the divorce. Now they were catching up, and it was really good that they were catching up, becoming friends again. So he's going to stay there the night, see you tomorrow morning. And then finally I saw him late on the Sunday. But the texts went all weekend and kept putting off his arrival time.
You must have thought you were going crazy.
Oh, I did.
Did you know the term gaslighting?
No, I didn't, believe it or not. But, I think this conversation about gaslighting is really only maybe I'm dreaming. I don't know. Maybe it was out there, but I don't think we talked about relationships like this.
No. Gaslighting is quite new. When I was in an emotionally abusive relationship, I didn't know that term until many years later when I looked back and I went, oh, that's what it was. I wish I'd have read an article about that. Because you think, oh, this is just me. Yep. This is just the very specific dynamics of this relationship. And what you describe is so familiar to anyone who's been involved with a guy who's either a liar or a psychopath or emotionally abusive. You start doubting yourself.
Yeah.
You don't think, oh, this guy's a dick and cut them loose, because even though from the outside people look at you and go, what are you doing?
But no one on my outside was saying that.
Well,
on my outside,
even your therapist.
Even my therapist, who I love, and I do not blame her for this for a moment, because she wasn't in the middle of the relationship. I could, in an hour session every couple of weeks or every week, I couldn't tell her everything that was going on. I can't remember what I missed to tell her. She wasn't seeing red flags. She kept on saying a man with a difficult ex-wife, 2 children, a farm, business interests, property development is going to have a complex life. And it's so different from your life. I'm not seeing red flags.
Steph, did you find yourself protecting his image from other people by not telling people everything about how many times he'd cancel or?
I'm pretty open, so I was probably telling my friends the truth.
At what point did they say?
They never. Only one ever did. Most of my friends were going. One friend said, "Stop being a weirdo until you've got a concrete evidence that he's lying. Stop being a weirdo." And my brother and sister-in-law would say, "You're going to ruin it. Relax, you're going to ruin it." There was one heterosexual friend, a guy who was. Then here's another phenomena for women of a certain age, my age, and even younger. By this stage, I was in my late 40s and he was in his mid-40s, but he was seeing women who were in their early 30s. So, even though he was only about 2 or 3 years younger than me, I was never, a rare single man in his mid-40s. He was separated with a young daughter as well, but I don't think he ever looked at, would look at a woman my age with an eye to thinking I was, because there's, he's going out with 30-year-olds.
That's important to understand, because that's the context for which someone who does show an interest in you and not a 28-year-old, that's really flattering, and there is a level of gratitude for that and appreciation of that.
Yeah.
And that's very real.
Absolutely. But this one heterosexual friend, I think he knew me just from a very few things I said. He said he was cynical. He didn't even need to ask me many questions. He didn't really. We sat one night at a sushi bar and I poured my anxieties out to him, and he said, yeah, when are you going to let this finish? When are you going to finish this?
How long had it been?
Oh, that was probably 7 months or so into the relationship, and he was ultimately the one that said, "You've got to end this," and he was the one that sort of picked me up and fed me. I hadn't been eating at the very end, and said, "You've got to end this. This is ridiculous."
How did you end it?
I emailed my ex and said, "I don't know what sort of hollow man you are, but you're a hollow man." And I put my finger on it, because now I can understand the psychology of what I'd been dealing with, which I didn't until I left the relationship. He's a hollow man, and I put my finger on it in that email when I broke up with him before I knew anything.
So what happened after you decided to end it? Because you worked at Fairfax at the time. You were sitting next to one of Australia's leading investigative journalists, the extraordinary Kate McClymont, who's brought down entire state governments through her investigative reporting.
Yes.
That would have been like just something she could have done before breakfast.
Exactly. It was actually another colleague, another great colleague, Anne Davies, who now works at The Guardian, who said to me, "Let's do some searches on him." And this is probably around 7 months into the relationship, and I was expressing anxieties to her about it. And I said, "Oh, no, this is a love affair. This isn't." I'd done my preliminary Googles, and I knew the sort of searches that we could do, title deed searches, to see what he owned, if he indeed was this multimillionaire, whether he owned the house that he lived in, bankruptcy searches. And
what about social media?
He didn't have a very big social media. He had a Twitter account that was pretty
typical for a man that age. That's not a red flag.
No, that's not a red flag at all.
No.
And very little online about him, but just, as I said before, enough to reassure me that his grandfather was who he said, and that he had an architectural practice at one point. But I said to Anne Davies, I said, "No, this is not a story. This is a love affair." And of course, that wasn't really the real reason. It was part of it. I didn't want to be a snoop, but I couldn't bear to look at what the truth was. And that's not uncommon. It's called willful blindness in psychological terms. And it's the same phenomenon, the person that goes to tan on sunbeds, whose doctor says you shouldn't do that, that's going to give you cancer.
Or smokers.
And it's the same phenomenon. You turn your eyes away from what you fear, what you don't want to know about. It's not convenient to look at it. And I was being willfully blind. Sure, there was a part of me that didn't want to snoop and felt that was a betrayal, but it was more about, I don't want to look, I can't look.
What made you decide to start looking? And
after I dumped him. After I dumped him, and then my curiosity was like insatiable. I had to know what I'd encountered, and can I keep some of the secrets from what I discovered? I discovered that he wasn't who he said he was at all, that he was bankrupt, that he didn't live in the house that his ex-wife did. That, in fact, I think he had no fixed address. I think he moved possibly between women. I think there was some suggestion that he squatted on boats on the harbour. Apparently there are any number of empty boats on the Sydney harbour. Owners don't visit very often. I discovered he'd been with another woman from the very first day of our relationship. I discovered that he didn't have the custody of the children that he claimed he had, that there was no farm, and ultimately I discovered that he'd been just simply a meddler in the Happy Valley purchase. Had presented himself as a buyer, but he had no money to buy it. And I eventually heard from the person that did buy it, who says he spent much, much more money on the property than he should have because of Joe's meddling in the sale. So he fooled lots of other people as well, in business as well. It wasn't just me. He's a very clever con artist, really. But the thing is about it, it's so weird. The benefits were so few for him, really. He didn't get, I don't think he's got money out of his con artistry. And I think what he got out of me and the other women that he's been involved with is an audience for his grand stories, which at the time I didn't see were grand stories. I just thought he's a busy man trying to buy a property and he wants to talk all about it. Now I can see it was just self-aggrandizement. It was him going, look at me, I'm so successful. And I allowed him to help build his facade around the hollow shell by listening to him and, I suppose, clapping. I was the audience.
Did you reach out to the woman he'd been with through your relationship? How did you find her?
So her social media. I found evidence of her on social media, and eventually, long time afterwards, I did reach out to her.
How did you discover that they'd been together through that time that you were
Her social media revealed just endless photographs and on both Facebook and Instagram that the day that his dog had been bitten by a snake, he was in fact at a resort in the Hunter Valley with her, playing board games and drinking wine at various wineries and swimming in a swimming pool, in between sending me text messages telling me about his dying dog, which presumably was at a vet hotel or a pet hotel somewhere. Her Facebook and Instagram gave me all the evidence I needed to see the pattern of lies. And once I knew the pattern of lies that he'd been lying to me at that level about her, about what he'd been doing, I could see that clearly the lies didn't stop there, that this was a much bigger scale.
That must have been devastating.
It's funny, I think it helped me start. It began my recovery. It was like, how could I be surprised by it? I know that the night that I sat there, I was on the phone to a girlfriend in Melbourne as I went through her Facebook, other woman's Facebook and Instagram. It was devastating and stunning, but not surprising. And I can't explain why I wasn't surprised. Like, something had to be up, and I came to see that by the end. But
was there relief in learning that you weren't crazy?
The relief came mostly not so long after that, when I started to Google the words pathological liar and boyfriend. And once I'd done that, this whole world opened up to me. And it was pop psychology rather than medical psychiatry, but it revealed so much to me about who he was and why he was the way he was, and the existence of these sorts of people out there. Narcissistic, people with personality disorders, most likely. And the internet, if you've ever been, once you've started to Google, it's like a rabbit hole. There's so much out there too. So many people telling their stories about these people. There are so many of them out there. It's terrifying. And after my original Good Weekend article, I got so many emails from people saying, that happened to me, similar story. And they're just gobsmacking, like women who've tried to commit suicide after these relationships have ended, and losing every skerrick of money that they've ever earned, and that the husband somehow, or the ex-boyfriend or partner, taking everything, turning children against them. And I should also add, women are capable of this behaviour too. It's not just men. I've certainly heard from many more women than men, which is probably a symptom of the fact that women tell their stories more readily than men do. But I've heard from men too. And one woman who I interviewed for my book, who had a bad relationship. She's an American woman, lives in Florida. She had a bad relationship with, funnily enough, an Australian sports person who'd gone to Florida to play in his sport. She now has a sort of a counselling, life coaching kind of service that she promotes through Instagram mainly. She says that she gets 50% men contacting her about bad women in their lives. That's the only stat I can really offer, because this is not researched, and I don't know how you would ever actually research it, because I've also got to be aware that a proportion of the people who contacted me after the original article and also after the book in the last couple of weeks, I've got dozens more, I think you've got to be aware that some of them might just be aggrieved. They might have blown out of proportion what their claims about their ex are. They're pissed off, they're unhappy, they've broken up. So I think you've got to set aside a few of those and go,
that's a fair point.
You can't take everyone as fact. And I don't know how you'd ever research the truth without going into these relationships in such detail. How do you ever prove the truth of them?
People feel so stupid.
Yep. And if they tell one lie and that doesn't work, they move on to the next lie.
Yeah.
And they can they weave the most incredibly intricate stories, and they tell one lie after another, and you can see there are contradictions, but, well, I could see there were contradictions in his stories, and that bothered me, but yeah, I was just immersed in it and I so much wanted it to work.
More of my conversation with the real-life Birdie Bell, Stephanie Wood, after this break. When your original Good Weekend piece came out, our mutual friend Amelia Lester was your editor on that story, and it was absolutely stunning and so powerful. And everybody was talking about it. I can see the cover of the Good Weekend in my mind's eye when I think about it. It came out on the Saturday, and on the Sunday I had lunch actually with a number of journalist girlfriends, and we were all saying, who is this guy? We need to find out who this guy is. I imagine, because you gave a number of details. You were careful, you didn't use his name. But did people recognise him and contact you?
Family members, some of his family did.
What did they say?
They made comments about the fact it wasn't the first time they'd heard these stories.
Did they feel bad?
Yeah, they did.
I suppose reaching out to you, they weren't defending him, put it that way.
They weren't defending him.
What about Joe himself?
I heard from him, yes, after that original Good Weekend article. I got a couple of very odd messages that were really disconnected from reality. He talked about how he was in a new relationship. It was sort of an apology, but it wasn't an apology. It's very difficult to describe just how weird the emails are. They're literate, the punctuation and grammar is right, but there's a non-sequential nature to them, a sort of a discombobulating kind of effect to them. And as I talk about in the book, it was really disturbing for a while, but then I started to laugh. And I heard things that he was saying about me, which were, if I don't take my medication, I do some strange things.
Gaslighting.
I stole money from my mother to buy my apartment. I'm a lesbian.
Who does he tell this to?
I hear it through a source, yeah.
And have you stayed, or did you, when you reached out to the woman he was having the relationship with, was she angry? Was she still with him at the time? How did that conversation unfold?
It was a really, really terrifying moment when I reached out to her, because I didn't know whether they were in a relationship or not. And as I detail in the book, there were a lot of light bulb moments as we talked about.
Was she open to talking to you?
Yes, very open to talking to me.
Had she ended the relationship by then?
Yes, she had.
She made a funny comment about a whiteboard.
Yeah, when we started to compare stories, she said, he must have had a whiteboard. And I got a picture in my head of him with different coloured marker pens and biting his lip and looking at his whiteboard and his different columns, and I was blue and she was red, and he'd compare the stories of how he was lying to each of us. And he lied to us differently. There were different lies. There were things that he said to me that he never said to her. He had a different name for his ex-wife for her that he told to her to me. And who knows why? Who knows why?
A lot of stuff to keep straight.
A lot of stuff to keep straight. And as a lot of people have said to me, why would you put yourself through that? The exhausting nature of that juggling act. It's just insane.
Stephanie, how do you date again after a Joe?
I don't know, Mia. I really don't know. Will anyone want to date me? I don't know.
Shut up. Look at you. You're gorgeous and smart and kind and brilliant.
You're very sweet. People might be scared that I might write about them, and I don't think anyone's ever going to come up to the standard of Joe I think I'm done with writing about my personal life. I'd never wanted to write about my personal life. And it's just unfolded that I have, and it's ridiculous. They're the stories that get the most traction. And I right now want to pull away from doing personal stories completely. I never want to write another one. But as I say that, I know that they're the stories that make a difference in people's lives. I get so many people saying, thank you. Your book is my Bible now.
Yeah.
You've saved my life. I understand what happened now. And that's enormously gratifying. We don't live long in this world, and not many of us can actually make a difference. And so as I say, I don't want to write more personal essays. I can see their power and how important they can be. But as for dating, I don't know. I just don't know. How do you have an online date with someone now, even if you're optimistic enough to think that there's someone online that might be half decent? What do you say to them when they ask, what do you do? Yeah, I write books about fakes that I meet online. what do I say?
I think they'll be fascinated.
And also, I think, and I don't want to make a big deal about this, but I feel a bit awkward about it. Once you have some sort of profile, I don't know, dating online feels weird to me.
I've got a friend who writes about sex. She's a sex kind of advice giver. But that would be hard to date. That would be really hard to date. Imagine taking that on board.
I know.
And she's just got married recently in her, what would she be? Late 50s probably, mid to late 50s.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Good for her.
Thank you for writing this book. I wish I could have read it a lot of years ago.
Yeah.
I hope that a lot of women do read it.
I hope that a lot of young women do.
Yes.
To stop them before they start a pattern of bad relationships and to show them that they're worthy of great love from the beginning, and if someone's not giving it to them, you walk away, and that to be single is often almost always better than being in a bad relationship.
You can see why this story was just crying out to be an on-screen thriller. And what's really wild is that this happened to Stephanie quite a few years ago when online dating was actually online, that is, before the apps even. And as you heard, she never even got into the Tinder and the Bumbles and the Hinges. So it's crazy to think about the catfishing and the fraud that can go on now when there's AI and so many new ways that liars can manipulate and cover their tracks. And really, that's why this story and now this series is really important, because this could have ended up in a much worse situation for Stephanie than it did. Women get hurt by men they meet online or on the apps. They get hurt emotionally, they get hurt financially, and sometimes tragically, they get hurt physically. And that's why Stephanie really wanted to tell her story. So if you're out there dating now, navigating the world of the apps, stay safe, follow your instincts, research your dates like you're a journalist or a detective. And if something in you says, this guy seems too good to be true, maybe he is.